The topic of chapter 11 of Anatomy of the Sacred, 6th edition, and Introduction to Religion by James C. Livingston is concerned with theodicy. The full title of chapter 11 is Theodicy, Encountering Evil. Now, the word theodicy, as the author tells us in the overview on page 235, comes from the Greek words theos and dike. Theos meaning God, and dike meaning justice. This word was not used in ancient Greece. It was in fact coined by the philosopher Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz, or Leibniz, Leibniz, in a book which carried the word theodicy in the title. It was written in French. It means the essay on theodicy. And theodicy, as used by Leibniz, who was also a famous mathematician, has to do with, quote unquote, justifying the ways of God. That is to say, justifying divine acts in the context of the existence of chaos and evil in the world. And chaos and evil in this view are regarded as real, as truly existing, and therefore they present a serious problem to the theist position, that is to say, to any religion which espouses a view of an all-powerful, all-loving deity, or God, capital G, of the kind we find in Christianity and Islam and in Judaism. Now, the actual content of the chapter looks at various approaches to the problem of theodicy, and that is a topic of a separate lecture. What I would like to do in this lecture is offer an actual solution to the problem of evil, or a solution, which the book does not do. And I thought that this was a useful exercise given the persistence of the question of theodicy, or the problem of evil. And so that's what I am going to take as my task for the remainder of this lecture. This is, in fact, a more or less recapitulation or a reworking of a lecture I gave, and I've given more than once, but I originally gave some years ago, entitled Attaining Wisdom, an Inquiry into the Problem of Evil. The immediate context of that lecture was Islamic, or within the context of the religion of Islam, but the actual argument is independent of any commitment to an Islamic belief. It simply assumes the basic assertion or upholding of theism. And so that is how I'm going to present it for this class, minus any immediate Islamic context. So wisdom may be understood as the integral knowledge of the primary causes of all things. This is how it was understood by the ancient philosopher Aristotle from ancient Greece in his famous work, The Metaphysics. And Aristotle exercised a tremendous influence on both Muslim, Jewish, as well as Christian theologians and philosophers who came after him. Aristotle was about 2 millennia ago. So wisdom as the integral knowledge of the primary causes of all things is the true aim and goal of philosophy. And philosophy, for people like Aristotle, for the ancient Greeks, as well as those who liked Aristotle among Jewish, Christian, and Muslim theologians and thinkers and philosophers, is none other than the love of wisdom. Its end result should be an explicative theory of meaning for the realities we experience as understood in relation to their transcendent source, which would be God, capital G, believed in some form or another by Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and seen as both the efficient and final cause of the universe. Efficient meaning he's the one who brings about the universe, what we discussed in cosmogony, and he is also the end goal of the universe. However, we all live in a time, in an age, in an historical context in which the meaning of truth itself has been called into question, what to say of wisdom or something so exalted as belief in God. We live in an intellectual climate of nihilism. Nihilism. What does that mean? It means a climate of extreme pessimism and skepticism, which proclaims all moral values as baseless and espouses relativism in ethics, skepticism in matters of knowledge of the world, what is known as epistemology, and rejects even the possibility of metaphysics. Metaphysics being a knowledge of things beyond the merely physical world, perceivable by our five senses. This profound malaise or illness or disease has now sunk deep roots and has a long history in the world. In the West, it was first noticed and properly diagnosed by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who died in 1900. Nietzsche understood that in such a world, belief in God would come to an end, and thus wrote, famously or infamously, God is dead. He actually, the full phrase is, God is dead and we have killed him, unquote. Since Nietzsche's time, subsequent historical developments, such as the death and devastation of the two world wars, only to be followed by yet more senseless, destructive conflicts, not to mention worldwide poverty, homelessness, unemployment, disease, depression, and meaninglessness, seem to have pushed more and more people towards some degree of nihilism. How could it not be so, since this state of affairs can only be described as irrational? Is it surprising, then, that people should lose all confidence in the notion of rationality, when the world they experience is also devoid of rationality? Yet it is simply not the case. Just because much of humanity, especially leaders on the world stage, have failed to adhere to rationality and have relinquished the pursuit of wisdom and the practice of virtue, this changes nothing, not one iota. It changes nothing of the essential nature of humanity. Human beings have been endowed with rationality and intelligence. Whether they choose to exercise their intelligence and exercise their free will or not is purely up to them. In any case, the question lingers in the minds of many. If human beings do have intelligence and free will, then why is there all this suffering, hardship, and injustice in the world? And indeed, if God is completely all-powerful and all-loving, why doesn't he put a stop to it all so we can live happily ever after? Indeed, many an atheist immersed in the nihilism of our age has made just such an argument to deny the very existence of God in the face of evil. So I would like to present an argument and an answer to the to the position rooted in nihilism, rooted in atheism, and we can rephrase or restate excuse me, the question which I want to address as follows. Here's the question. How could a good God permit evil and suffering? Which would then take the form of the following argument on the part of those who reject the existence of God on the basis of the existence of evil and suffering in the world. So 1, it is held that God is omnipotent, meaning all-powerful and perfectly good. There are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do, and a perfectly good being will eliminate evil. So, if such a God exists, then he would eliminate all evil and would want to do so. But evil exists, which means that God is either not omnipotent or not perfectly good or does not exist. Therefore, the atheist takes the last option and says God does not exist. The first two possibilities, that either he is not omnipotent or not perfectly good, those are discarded since it is the contention of those who believe in God that God is omnipotent and perfectly good. So we can refer to this argument as the atheist argument. Questions of this kind, arguments of this kind, are not new. By which I mean arguments or questions like this against the existence of God are not new. They're based on doubts which have been around for centuries. In the context of academic philosophy, such an argument was put forward in the second half of the 20th century by the prominent atheist and philosopher J.L. Mackie in a paper entitled Evil and Omnipotence, which was published in the journal Mind, new series, volume 64, number 254, which was in April 1955, and his article appeared on pages 200 to 212. And I quote from that directly. His actual words are, "The problem of evil, in the sense in which I shall be using the phrase, is a problem only for someone who believes there is a God who is both omnipotent and wholly good." That's on page 200. On the same page, Mackie says, in its simplest form, the problem is this: God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. There seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. But at the same time, all three are essential parts of most theological positions. The theologian, again, whether he's Christian, Jewish, or Islamic, that's my interjection. The theologian, it seems, writes Mackie, at once must adhere and cannot consistently adhere to all three. So the propositions God is omnipotent and perfectly good, and evil exists are true. God is omnipotent and perfectly good is true, and evil exists are true. Yet the conclusion, I argue, that God does not exist does not follow from these two premises. In order to establish why this is the case, we must clarify what is meant by God's omnipotence, as well as what is meant by his being wholly good. Moreover, the terms good, bad, and its equivalent evil must also be clarified. Without clarification of these terms, the tenuous rationality of the atheist argument remains hidden. So what is meant by divine omnipotence? God is omnipotent, omnipotent. It means he is all-powerful. By powerful, we mean the capacity to act or make. So I'm not going to go into a full logical demonstration of the existence of God here, but I could. But we're just assuming that God exists in this argument. We're arguing from the theist perspective. But once you establish the existence of God, it is clear that all that is other than God is in a state of radical ontological indigence or need, by which I mean that it is the very nature of the contingent to be in need of an efficient cause, that is to say, something to bring it into being. Not only is the contingent in need of God to exist, but to act as well. This applies to inanimate objects as well, not just humans and animals who are able to act. The sense of act used here is in contrast to another term, namely potency. For anything to truly exist and fully actualize its potencies and thus truly manifest its full nature is fully dependent upon God. The existence and action of all things are fully encompassed by God's power and derive the totality of the respective capacities from the divine omnipotence, since his power encompasses all things. The question naturally arises then, does this mean that God can do anything? The answer hinges upon how we understand the term anything. Indeed, God can cause to exist or make happen anything that could, in principle, exist or happen. However, if by anything is meant his causing a contradiction to come into being, such as his making a triangular cube, then the answer is no. A cube is a three-dimensional object consisting of 6 square-shaped surfaces joined at right angles, whilst a triangle is a three-sided, flat, plane figure. The nature of the one completely excludes the nature of the other. It is as absolutely meaningless to speak of a triangular cube as it is to speak of God creating one. This is not because there is any kind of limitation to God's power. By this I mean it is not because there is such a thing as the capacity to create a triangular cube and that God lacks such a capacity. Rather, it is that there is no such thing as the capacity to make a triangular cube in the first place. No such thing exists, nor can such a thing exist. Just as no such thing as a triangular cube exists just as no such thing as a triangular cube can exist, for the existence of the latter would rest upon the existence of the capacity to make it, and thus the entire notion of a triangular cube is self-contradictory. This also applies to the favorite question of many simple-minded atheists that can God create a stone that is too heavy for him to lift? The atheist thinks he has cornered the theist. For whether he answers yes or no, this entails that there is something that God cannot do. In case he answers yes, it means God cannot lift the stone. If he answers no, it means God cannot create the stone. However, the very notion of a stone too heavy for God to lift is self-contradictory. As self-contradictory, in fact, as a triangular cube. Causing a stone to levitate is a possible state of affairs, and God certainly does not lack the capacity to do so. Similarly, preventing a stone from levitating is another state of affairs, and God certainly does not lack the capacity to do that either. However, the two states of affairs are contradictory, meaning that both cannot occur to the same stone on the same occasion, at the same time, at the same place. Given the contradictory character of these two states of affairs, God cannot create them or cause them to come into being at the same time. Again, it is not because he lacks the capacity for either of the two, but simply because there is no such thing as the capacity to make a stone too heavy for God to lift in the first place. All right, this then is what I mean by divine omnipotence. Now, what is meant by good, by bad, and by evil? And moreover, what does it mean to say that God is perfectly good? Judgments regarding something being good or bad are not all instances of subjective fancy. We can speak of such and such a thing being a good or a bad specimen of that thing. For example, if someone wants to buy a watermelon and notices that it has some defect, then such a watermelon may be objectively characterized as a bad watermelon, inasmuch as it fails to fully realize what it means to be a watermelon because of the defect in question. Such a defect represents a lack, a privation of some quality, which were it present would have fully actualized the essence of being a watermelon in the full sense of the term, namely a good watermelon. Thus, we may speak of a good or a bad instance or of a specimen of a tree or of a house or of a bicycle in the sense that that thing's success, quote unquote, or failure, quote unquote, in living up to the standard inherent in that kind of the thing it is, namely its essence. In the case of moral goodness or badness, and moral badness we take as being synonymous with evil, these terms only apply to the volitional acts of human beings. Volitional means free will acts of human beings. So here goodness applies to a freely chosen act by a human being that facilitates the realization of the potentials in a human being, which, given that human being's essence or nature, he or she is in need of realizing in order to flourish. Similarly, badness would apply to a freely chosen act by a human being that frustrates the realization of such potentials. Good actions lead to a movement, so to speak, of the human soul from potentiality to actuality in the realization of human flourishing, in contrast to bad actions, which hamper and frustrate this movement, this process, this transformation. Goodness then involves being actual in some way, by which I mean it is actual in the realization of what is only latent and implicit in the nature or the essence of a thing. Badness or evil, however, involves a failure to be actual in some way, by which I mean in a way that fails to realize what is only latent and implicit in the nature or essence of a thing. Therefore, badness or evil is seen to be a privation, that is to say, the absence of something which a fully actualized instance or specimen of something would or should possess by virtue of its nature. Goodness is related to presence and therefore to existence, whereas badness or evil is related to absence and therefore to non-existence. Goodness is a kind of actuality, and badness is a kind of unrealized potentiality. All things other than God are a mixture of potentiality and actuality, of potency and act. God is pure actuality without any potentiality. He is absolute simplicity of act in action. He has no intrinsic or extrinsic parameters, boundaries, or restrictions, and is capable of unrestrictedly acting in any and all non-contradictory ways. The key is non-contradictory. Thus, God is pure goodness, and there is no trace of badness or evil in God. This, then, is what I mean by good, by bad, by evil, and by what it means to say that God is wholly or perfectly good. We can now turn directly to the refutation of the atheist argument. The atheist argument concludes with the contention that the existence of evil in the world is logically inconsistent with God's existence if it is held that he is omnipotent and perfectly good. It is my contention that this conclusion does not follow from the premises. It is paramount that the meanings of the key terms that I have already set out be constantly borne in mind as I proceed with the argument that follows. It is not true to say without qualification that there are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. Again, not due to lack of capacity on the part of the omnipotent being to be able to create something or bring about some state of affairs, but rather because if the thing or state of affairs in question is self-contradictory, then such a capacity does not exist in the first place. I illustrated this earlier in the lecture with the example of the triangular cube. Thus, God does not violate the law of non-contradiction, which is also confusingly known as the law of contradiction, and is absolutely fundamental to logic. It is referred to as the mother of all propositions by some logicians, and it states that a proposition cannot both be true and false at the same time in the same sense. That's what it is in logic. In metaphysics, metaphysically, this means that a thing cannot both be, that is to say exist, and not be, that is to say not exist, at the same time in the same respect. In other words, a thing cannot both exist and not exist at the same time in the same sense. Thus, if it be the case that there are some instances of good which cannot logically be realized without allowing certain evils to exist as well, then even God could not cause such instances of good to occur without allowing those evils to exist as well, any more than he could make a spherical cube. In the light of what I've just said, we can see that divine omnipotence is not logically inconsistent with the existence of evil in the world. It is also not true that a wholly good being will eliminate all evil from the world. To eliminate some evils may entail elimination of those instances of good that presuppose the existence of those evils. Hence, even if God could eliminate such evils, he may well not do so in order to preserve these goods. What is meant by a good that presupposes the existence of some evil, you may ask? Abundant illustrations of such goods are to be found in child rearing, raising children. A father must ensure that his child studies diligently, completes his assignments, does not dine exclusively on chocolates, and so on and so forth, however unpleasant these experiences may be for the child. Similarly, in order to excel in any form of athleticism, considerable hardship and sacrifice, physical, mental, emotional, and so forth, are required. Indeed, no goal worthy of attainment is without some degree of struggle and hardship. Struggles and hardship constitute the efficient cause for the realization of latent potencies. Let us consider what sort of goods would cease to exist in the world if all evil were eliminated therefrom. Human beings have free will. Thus, they are capable of committing evil, and history bears witness that a great many have always done so, unfortunately. It is clear also that in order to eliminate all evil from the world, free will, too, would have to be eliminated. The kind of creature that would result would not be a human being as we understand the term, but some other sort of being altogether. Moreover, there would be no meaningful notion of the moral responsibility of such a creature, as well as any notion of divine reward and punishment. Thus, the removal of all evil from the world is not logically consistent with free will. Thus far, we have only considered evil in the moral sense. But what about natural disasters, such as tsunamis, earthquakes, conflagrations due to lightning strikes, in other words, something like forest fires, asteroid impacts, crop failure, famine, plague, and so on and so forth. These too would have to be eliminated, and we would then be left with a very strange world indeed. The objection might be raised that there is no need for God to create such a world in which free will also ceases to exist in order to eliminate evil therefrom. God could simply create a world in which human beings retain their free will, but never exercise it in committing evil. I suppose you could argue that, but that is to say they retain the capacity for both good and evil, but never choose to do it. While we may concede this point and recognize that in such a world where every human being has some sort of almost infallibility of some kind, and also admit that even in such a world, choices of no small moral significance would be made, such as abstaining from murder and robbery and so on, but it does not follow that in such a world, all moral goods that exist in our world would be realized in that world. Let me explain. The reason for this is that there would still remain instances of the exercise of free will, which require the existence of people who commit evil. Mercy and forgiveness can only be exercised toward another person who's committed a wrong against you. The latter is also privative, and thus comes under the notion of badness or evil, as we already have explained earlier in the lecture. Patience and forbearance can only be realized in the face of hardship and adversity. Courage and fortitude are only possible in the face of danger to life or property or status and the like. Compassion and empathy cannot be realized without those who have suffered misfortune. Sacrifice is not possible without the loss of that which one holds dear. All of these examples, with necessary modifications, also apply to the case of natural disasters. Thus, it must be noted, and noted well, that the question at stake is not merely one of the goodness of free will in the abstract, nor even merely of morally significant free choices, but of those morally significant acts which contribute to the realization and development of virtues of the sort we have just listed. Another objection might be raised that even if God permits such evils in order that human beings may develop the full range of their virtues, it nevertheless stands to reason that at least some instances of evil and suffering that actually exist in our world could have been prevented by an omnipotent God without losing a greater good or bringing about some equally bad or worse evil. Therefore, it is still possible that an omnipotent, holy, good God does not exist. That's the objection. It is true that this might be a valid objection, were it not for the fact that there are other very strong demonstrative proofs, what are called apodictive proofs, for the existence of God, and that such a logical demonstration can be developed further to establish God's uniqueness, omniscience, omnipotence, perfect goodness, as well as other attributes independent of the debate about theodicy regarding the logical consistency of his existence and the existence of evil in the world. For such an objection to have real force, all other arguments for the existence of God would have to be refuted. This also applies to the original atheist argument with which we began this lecture. Nevertheless, one can reply to this objection by noting that it is not at all established that some instances of evil and suffering that actually exist in our world could have been prevented in the manner claimed. How does the objector know this? We simply do not have a complete and fully detailed knowledge of the totality of all instances of evil and their concomitant goods, or the putative absence thereof, at any given moment. Thus, this objection collapses under its own assumptions. Therefore, in the light of everything I have said so far, it is seen that the perfect goodness of God is not logically inconsistent with the existence of evil in the world. By way of conclusion, Having clarified what is meant by divine omnipotence, by good and by evil, and by the perfect goodness of God, it has been established that the existence of an omnipotent and wholly good God is not logically inconsistent with the existence of evil in the world. Thus, the conclusion of the atheist argument set out at the beginning of the lecture that God does not exist does not follow from its premises. QED, as they used to say, which is Latin for quod erat demonstrandum, which is that is what we set out to prove. But let's let J.L. Mackie himself have the final word on his own argument. Many years after the paper, which he published in Mind in 1955, he was forced to admit that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. He said this in a book he wrote called The Miracle of Theism, published by Oxford University Press in 1982 on page 154. So he finally concedes that we cannot indeed take the problem of evil as a conclusive disproof of traditional theism. So I will stop there. I hope you found this useful. This is a very detailed and involved argument. Some parts of it are indeed difficult, but if you go back and listen to this another time, hopefully the matter will become clearer to you. Thank you very much.